In the very heart of ancient Rome, where marble columns reached upward like the arms of titans and the forum echoed with the voices of senators and priests, there burned a flame that was never meant to die. This was no ordinary fire, it was the eternal flame of Vesta, the goddess of the hearth, whose light was believed to shield Rome itself from disaster. To let it flicker, to let it fail, was to risk the wrath of the gods and the ruin of the empire. Guarding this sacred blaze were the Vestal Virgins. They were not ordinary women, nor were they free to live ordinary lives. Chosen as children, sometimes as young as 6, they were torn from their families in solemn rituals that sealed their fates forever. The Pontifex Maximus, Rome's high priest, would approach their parents not with an offer, but with a command from the gods. And once the child's hand was taken, there was no return. These girls were led into the circular temple of Vesta, its design echoing the hearth of the Roman home, yet inside it was a place of chilling silence. There, the girls began their 30-year sentence of service, 10 years of training, 10 years of tending the flame, and 10 years of teaching others to follow. In that time, their bodies no longer belonged to themselves. They belonged to Rome. Their every breath was an offering. Their every heartbeat was a vow. To the Roman people, the Vestals were living symbols of divine favor. When they walked through the streets, even consuls and generals stepped aside. They could pardon a condemned man with nothing more than a touch. They dined at the finest banquets and sat in places of honor at gladiatorial games. Yet, beneath this veil of privilege lay a shadow darker than death itself. For the Vestals lived under a law harsher than any soldier, harsher even than an emperor. Their vow was absolute chastity. An oath that bound not only their bodies but the very fate of Rome. To falter, even in thought, was to invite catastrophe. And should suspicion ever fall upon them, the same city that once knelt at their feet would turn into a merciless executioner. Thus the Vestals lived in a paradox, adored as Rome's holiest women, yet haunted every moment by the threat of unspeakable punishment. Their white robes shone with sacred honor, but behind their eyes lingered a constant, silent terror. For they knew the truth whispered across generations, that Rome's eternal fire could one day become their funeral pyre. In Rome, power often came clad in armor or enshrined in law. Yet there existed a class of women whose strength lay in silence and in fire. The Vestal Virgins moved through the streets not like ordinary citizens but like living omens. A magistrate, armored in the authority of the Republic, would step aside as one passed. A general, fresh from victory, would bow his head as her white robes swept by. She was untouchable, untouchable not by force of arms, but by force of belief. Their privileges astonished even the Romans themselves. A Vestal could own property, something denied to nearly all women. She could sit in the front rows of the Colosseum, a place reserved for the most honored of Rome's elite. She could halt an execution with a mere touch, pulling a condemned man from the jaws of death, his life redeemed in the eyes of gods and men alike. Their presence embodied purity, and purity was power. But this power was no gift. It was a curse wrapped in reverence. For every honor came with an unspoken reminder, all of it rested on the razor's edge of chastity. Rome believed the very fate of the empire was tethered to the untouched bodies of these women. The flame they guarded might illuminate the city, but it also cast shadows deep and merciless. The law was unyielding. A Vestal could not marry, could not love, could not even allow her eyes to linger too long upon another. A smile mistaken for desire could become suspicion. A whispered conversation in a darkened corridor could grow into accusation. A single rumor, careless, whispered, or fabricated, could shatter her world. The people of Rome saw the Vestals as divine, but they also feared them. Their sanctity was fragile, and if the empire faltered, if famine struck, if plague spread, if armies failed, it was not uncommon for whispers to turn into blame. And blame, in Rome, was deadly. The paradox was cruel. The Vestal Virgins lived as queens and yet as prisoners. Their white robes gleamed in the sun, but they were chains stitched from fabric. Their honored seats at the games placed them above the crowd, yet every drop of blood spilled below reminded them of their own peril. For the punishment that awaited a failed Vestal was darker than anything suffered in the arena sands. Thus, their lives were suspended between adoration and annihilation. The Romans revered them as the living breath of the gods. But all it took was a single shadow, a single rumor, for that same city to demand their slow, suffocating death. The Romans believed the gods were watchful, their favor fragile, and their wrath swift. If the sacred flame in Vesta's temple dimmed even for a moment, it was not simply a failure of ritual, it was a sign of divine anger. And if a Vestal Virgin was accused of breaking her vow, Rome itself trembled, for plague, famine, or military defeat were thought to follow her disgrace. This belief gave birth to a culture of constant suspicion. Every gesture, every word, every glance of a Vestal was scrutinized not only by priests but by the citizens who lived in fear of disaster. A whisper exchanged in the wrong place, at the wrong time, could be seized upon as evidence of hidden sin. A gift from a man, innocent or not, might be presented as proof of corruption. Even the way a woman dressed, an elaborate hairstyle, a hint of jewelry, a smile deemed too warm, could condemn her in the eyes of Rome. The very sanctity of the Vestals became their greatest danger. They were not allowed to be human, for humanity was weakness, and weakness could destroy an empire. A simple act of kindness could be twisted into seduction. A flicker of joy could be interpreted as forbidden desire. Even the light of the sacred flame they tended seemed to burn not only as Rome's protection, but as a merciless spotlight upon their every move. In such an atmosphere, fear was weaponized. Enemies within the Senate, rivals among the aristocracy, even jealous fellow priestesses could exploit the system of suspicion. To accuse a Vestal was to invoke divine terror, and in a city where omens carried more weight than truth, an accusation alone could become a death sentence. The people themselves were complicit. Citizens watched the Vestals with reverence, but also with dread. If their city suffered, if floods came, if armies fell, eyes turned toward the women in white. It was easier to blame them than to question the failures of generals or the corruption of senators. Thus, the Vestals became convenient scapegoats for Rome's misfortunes, their lives hanging on the fragile balance of public fear. And so they walked through the forum like living ghosts, praised as Rome's holiest women, yet followed always by the shadow of suspicion. Their white robes glowed in the sunlight, but behind them stretched a darker silhouette, shaped not by their deeds but by the paranoia of a city that demanded perfection. For in Rome, the line between purity and peril was razor thin, and even the faintest rumor could drag a Vestal Virgin from honor into the tomb. When suspicion fell upon a Vestal Virgin, the terror did not come with fire and swords but with silence and shadows. The moment the accusation was whispered, her world collapsed. She was seized and placed under guard, torn away from the eternal flame she had tended for years. To be separated from that fire was itself a sentence of death, for it was not just the flame of Vesta, it was her identity, her very reason to exist. The trial that awaited her was not one of justice. It was a ritual, a performance cloaked in the authority of religion. Convened by the pontifices, the high priests of Rome, these secret tribunals were designed not to discover truth but to confirm suspicion. There were no advocates, no defense, no rights to appeal. The Vestal's voice was drowned in the echo of sacred chants, her words dismissed as the desperate lies of the guilty. Evidence was almost never evidence at all. A rumor, a glance, a letter hidden in her chambers, even the way her eyes lingered on a man in the crowd, such scraps of gossip were elevated to divine signs. The priests claimed that the gods themselves spoke through omens and shadows, that truth was revealed not in facts but in the trembling of flames or the flight of birds. How could she hope to defend herself against the will of the heavens? The interrogation was relentless. She was questioned again and again, her answers twisted, her silences interpreted as confession. Her sisters in the temple were called to bear witness, their testimonies tainted by jealousy, fear, or the simple need to protect themselves. The tribunal became a theater of terror, every face in the chamber watching her as if she already carried the stain of guilt. Isolation was her first punishment. Once accused, she was forbidden from tending the flame or joining in sacred rites. The robes that had once given her honor now marked her as a pariah, her presence seen as a threat to Rome's divine covenant. She sat alone in her chamber, cut off from the gods she had served, haunted by the knowledge that her fate rested not on truth, but on power. The Romans told themselves that the gods would reveal the guilty. But in truth, it was men, ambitious, fearful, ruthless, who decided life or death. The trial of a Vestal Virgin was never about justice. It was about control, about the power to bend divine fear into political weapon. And once the tribunal began, the outcome was certain: innocence was a dream, guilt was inevitable, and the shadow of the tomb grew closer with every whispered accusation. Roman law forbade the spilling of a Vestal Virgin's blood. No blade, no cross, no arena could claim her life, for such violence would offend the gods. But the Romans, masters of both ritual and cruelty, devised a punishment more terrifying than death itself: live burial. Once condemned, the Vestal was paraded through the streets of Rome in silence. No trumpets sounded, no cheers were raised. Instead, the crowd lined the streets in a hush as heavy as stone. Some wept quietly, tears streaking down their faces, for even in disgrace she had once been sacred. Others trembled, clutching children to their chests, terrified by the lesson they were being forced to witness. The procession was not just punishment, it was theater, a spectacle designed to remind every Roman that the gods demanded obedience. Children were lifted onto their fathers' shoulders to see. Their wide eyes, uncomprehending, were meant to absorb the lesson, that even the holiest of women could be destroyed if she faltered. Fear was woven into their childhood as surely as the flame was tended in the temple. The silence of the march pressed down upon all who watched, broken only by the crackling torches that lit the way. At the edge of the city waited the pit, a narrow underground chamber carved into the earth, prepared for her final imprisonment. The condemned Vestal was led down into the darkness, her white robes brushing against the stone as though purity itself were being dragged into a grave. Inside the chamber lay the cruel mockery of mercy: a loaf of bread, a small jug of water, and a single oil lamp. Enough to sustain life for hours, perhaps days, but only so that death might arrive slowly, cruelly, and inescapably. When she stepped inside, the priests averted their eyes. They told themselves this spared their hands from bloodshed, that the gods would not be angered. But their refusal to watch did not make the act less monstrous. As the heavy slab was lowered over the entrance, sealing her fate, the last shaft of light faded from her terrified face. Above ground, the crowd listened in dreadful silence as the final stone settled into place. For a moment, muffled cries, or the faint sound of fists against stone could be heard, then nothing. The silence was absolute. The Romans returned to their homes, shaken, reminded that the gods were merciless and their priests even more so. Thus ended the life of a Vestal Virgin, buried alive, starved of hope, smothered in darkness. It was a death without blood, but with a cruelty that bled into the soul of every Roman who witnessed it. Throughout Rome's long history, the trials of the Vestal Virgins became a stage for politics, jealousy, and fear. These women were not simply judged for their vows, they were exploited as pawns in the ruthless games of power. 3 cases stand out, each as haunting as the last. The first is Postumia, in 420 BCE. She was not condemned for passion, nor caught in any scandalous act. Her crime was far more insidious in its vagueness: her laughter, her manner of dress, her very demeanor. Senators whispered that she was too worldly, too bold, too much like an ordinary woman. They twisted her personality into evidence of sin. Before the tribunal she protested, her white robes glowing beneath the torchlight, but her words were dismissed as insolence. Postumia's case revealed the perilous truth: a Vestal's purity was never about facts, but about perception. A smile could become a death sentence. Centuries later, under the reign of Emperor Domitian, the tragedy repeated itself with Cornelia, the chief Vestal. Her case shook Rome to its core. The evidence was so thin that even the College of Priests hesitated, yet Domitian demanded her execution. Cornelia cried out in the forum that Caesar himself could not believe such lies. Her voice rose above the crowd, desperate, defiant, but to no avail. Dragged to her tomb, she vanished into darkness, still proclaiming her innocence. Her fate became a warning that even the most powerful Vestal could be destroyed if it served the emperor's will. Then came Julia Aquilia, forced into marriage by decree. It was not love, nor even her choice, but compulsion. Yet the forced union became the very weapon used against her. Accused of breaking vows she had never willingly forsaken, she was condemned without mercy. The irony was cruel. Rome itself had broken her vows, and then Rome punished her for it. In her death, the full hypocrisy of the system was laid bare. These cases show that the Vestals were never judged as individuals. They were symbols, sacrifices upon the altar of politics and fear. Their lives and deaths were shaped not by guilt, but by the needs of the powerful. And for every Postumia, Cornelia, or Julia Aquilia, there were countless others whose names were lost to time, their cries silenced in the earth. The stories of these women reveal the darkest truth of all: in Rome, purity was never protection. It was a weapon, one that could be turned upon the very women sworn to uphold it. The fate of a Vestal Virgin was never truly about her vows. It was about power. Time and again, their trials and executions coincided with moments of crisis in Rome, times of military defeat, political instability, or bitter rivalries between factions. When the empire trembled, the Vestals became the sacrifice, their lives offered up not to the gods, but to the ambitions of men. To execute a Vestal was to send a message. A general who had lost a war could deflect blame, declaring that the gods had turned against Rome because of a broken vow. A senator facing unrest could remind the people that no one, not even the holiest women, was above the law. An emperor, paranoid and eager to appear strong, could tighten his grip on the city by condemning a Vestal in the name of divine justice. These women became pawns in spectacles of terror, their suffering transformed into a theater of authority. The people understood the performance. They gathered in silence when a Vestal was paraded through the streets, trembling at the sight. Her punishment was more than a ritual, it was a warning. If Rome's most sacred figures could be buried alive, then what hope was there for ordinary citizens? The message was unmistakable: obedience was survival. Yet there was more to be gained than fear alone. The trials of Vestals often carried an undercurrent of greed. Many came from powerful aristocratic families whose wealth and estates stretched across Rome. A conviction did not just destroy the woman, it dismantled her family's influence. Their lands could be seized, their wealth redistributed among accusers, allies, and those in power. What began as an accusation of impiety could end in a political windfall. Justice became a mask, hiding what was nothing more than sanctioned plunder. This twisted system ensured that the accusation of a Vestal was never merely religious. It was strategic. A rival's daughter could be condemned to weaken a family's standing. An emperor could silence opposition by targeting Rome's most untouchable symbols. To strike at a Vestal was to strike at the heart of society, all while cloaking the act in the authority of the gods. And so the Vestals lived not only under the weight of chastity, but under the crushing burden of politics. Their robes symbolized purity, but in truth they were targets, shields of marble for Rome's rulers, weapons of fear for its priests, and prizes of fortune for its enemies. In their persecution, Rome revealed its darkest truth, that fear and faith were tools in the same bloody hand of power. For the Vestals who remained in the temple, every day was a life lived in shadow. They knew with chilling certainty that they might be next. The fate of one sister was a warning to all others, her burial a reminder carved into their very souls. Within the sacred halls of Vesta, silence reigned, not the silence of peace, but of fear. It was fear that transformed the temple into a prison. The Vestals watched one another not out of sisterhood, but out of survival. Every glance, every word, every gesture became evidence waiting to be twisted. A laugh could be reported as insolence, a glance at a man as desire. Suspicion rotted their bonds from within, until friendship itself became a danger. To confide in another was to risk betrayal, to trust was to invite death. Love was not only forbidden, it was treason. To feel the warmth of affection, to long for human touch, was to commit a crime against Rome itself. Any hint of desire was seen as rebellion against the gods. The Vestals were women stripped of their humanity, remade into living symbols, and crushed beneath the weight of perfection they could never sustain. Their hearts were bound in chains no less cruel than the iron bars of a dungeon. And yet it was not only the Vestals who lived in terror. The people of Rome themselves understood the lesson. They saw the women paraded in disgrace, they saw the stones sealed over the tomb, and they trembled. For if the gods could be so merciless to their holiest servants, what chance did an ordinary man or woman have? The fate of the Vestals became a mirror held up to the city, showing that no one, no matter how sacred, was safe. This was the true power of the executions, not simply to punish, but to teach. To teach silence. To teach obedience. To teach that questioning authority was to invite the wrath of both gods and men. Rome became a society bound not by love or faith, but by fear. Fear of the gods above, and fear of the emperor who claimed to speak for them. The temple of Vesta glowed with the eternal flame, but its fire no longer symbolized warmth or protection. It burned instead as a beacon of dread, a constant reminder that the same fire which lit the city's destiny could just as easily consume those sworn to guard it. And so the Vestals lived, moving like ghosts through marble halls, bound together not by trust, but by the terrible knowledge that silence was the only path to survival. As centuries passed, the shadow of terror that had hung over the Vestals began to fade. Rome itself was changing. The endless parade of executions no longer carried the same power, and whispers of doubt began to spread among philosophers and citizens alike. The Stoics, with their cold but reasoned wisdom, began to ask a dangerous question: was mercy not more divine than cruelty? Could the gods truly demand such savage deaths from their most faithful servants? Their words did not save the condemned of the past, but they cracked the marble foundations of fear. Meanwhile, a new faith began to stir within the empire. Christianity spread from whispered gatherings in secret catacombs to the very palaces of emperors. Where once the eternal flame of Vesta burned as Rome's protection, now the cross began to gleam as the symbol of salvation. The Vestals, once revered as the city's holiest guardians, found their power waning. The people no longer looked to the round temple and its sacred fire, but to the promise of a new eternal light, one not bound by fear of God's wrath, but by hope of redemption. By the late 4th century, the College of Vestals had dwindled to little more than a relic, a fragment of an older world. No longer did the city tremble at every rumor of unchastity. No longer did emperors find strength in condemning priestesses to the tomb. The sacred fire still burned, but its meaning had become a shadow of what it once was, a flicker of Rome's pagan past, slowly dimming against the rising dawn of a new faith. Then came the year 394 CE. Emperor Theodosius, determined to purge the empire of its old gods, delivered the final decree. The eternal flame of Vesta was to be extinguished, the Vestals disbanded, their 1,000-year vigil ended. For the first time since the days of Rome's legendary kings, the sacred fire went dark. The smoke curled upward into the cold air, vanishing into the night as if the gods themselves had abandoned the city. It was the end of an era. With the snuffing out of the flame came the end of Rome's most haunting tradition. No longer would young girls be torn from their families. No longer would women in white robes walk in terror, knowing that a single rumor could bury them alive. But the memory remained, carved into Roman history like scars upon the flesh of the empire. 1,000 years of fear, obedience, and cruelty ended not with blood, but with silence, and the extinguishing of a light that had once bound an empire together. Today, Historians look back on the punishment of the Vestal Virgins and call it by a name as haunting as the practice itself: sacred violence. It was cruelty sanctified, brutality disguised as duty, suffering wrapped in the robes of religion. These women were not merely buried beneath stone and earth, they were entombed beneath the weight of a society that fused faith, law, and power into one merciless machine. The chambers where the condemned Vestals perished were more than tombs. They were mirrors, reflecting the darkest truth of Rome, that the state could transform horror into ritual, that terror itself could be offered up as an act of worship. Each shovelful of dirt, each torch extinguished above the sealed vault, was not only the silencing of a woman's life, but the affirmation of Rome's authority. The people bowed their heads not only to the gods, but to the men who claimed to speak for them. This is why the story of the Vestals still chills the modern world. Their fate demonstrates how easily power can masquerade as piety. When leaders invoked the gods, when priests proclaimed divine necessity, the line between justice and atrocity blurred into nothingness. Rome convinced itself that its survival required cruelty, that the death of a single woman was worth the salvation of the city. And in that belief, ordinary citizens became complicit, watching in silence as innocence was entombed. The legacy of these punishments did not end with the fall of the Temple of Vesta. It echoed across centuries, reappearing whenever religion was twisted into a weapon, whenever the law became a mask for vengeance, whenever politics demanded victims clothed in righteousness. The buried Vestals became symbols not only of Rome's cruelty, but of humanity's capacity to sanctify the unthinkable. Their story lingers as a warning. When power cloaks itself in holiness, when authority claims the mantle of divine justice, there are no limits to what men will do. The most sacred can be made monstrous, and the most innocent can be made guilty. What Rome called duty, the world now sees as atrocity. Yet the pattern endures, societies find ways to justify brutality, so long as it is wrapped in ritual, law, or faith. The eternal flame has long been extinguished, but its shadow remains. It reminds us that sacred violence was not unique to Rome, it is a danger that rises wherever fear and faith are bound together. The Vestals' tombs whisper across time, urging us never to forget how easily the holy can become a weapon, and how swiftly justice can descend into darkness.